Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about strategic design. On today's episode, I am completing what has become a long-running series on strategic design by talking to Marco Steinberg. For those of you who have listened to the podcast for a while, will know Marco's name. He is a former architecture professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and was the founder of the Helsinki Design Lab, a strategic design team that was embedded in the Finnish government. I've talked to three other HDL members, Brian Boyer, Dan Hill, and Justin Cook. And Brian and Justin were also Marco's students at Harvard and went with him to Helsinki to work. But they all cited Marco as a huge influence on their careers and work and thinking. And so I was really excited to finally have Marco on the show. Marco currently works independently on strategic design, primarily with governments, but also other organizations who need some kind of change or time to reflect on their own processes. So in this conversation, Marco and I talk about how he got into strategic design from working as an architect and a professor, and what strategic design means to him and why that term describes how he thinks about his work and what his role is. We also talk about how clients engage him and how his practice has shifted from one where he was embedded within the government to now being an outsider tasked with helping reshape organizations from the outside. For those of you who have listened to the podcast for a while and to those other conversations with the former Helsinki Design Lab team, know that strategic design is something that I have been really interested in. So I really enjoyed this conversation and kind of rounding out this series of conversations around this topic. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism, as well as previews of upcoming episodes. Scratching the Surface is fully supported through these memberships, so if you like the show and want to help with its ongoing production, I hope that you consider joining. Thank you, as always, for listening, and enjoy this conversation with Marco Steinberg. You know, I talked to Brian Boyer, I talked to Dan Hill, I talked to Justin Cook, all people who spoke very highly of you. They talked about their time in Helsinki at the Design Lab. And so I've talked about strategic design. I've talked about a lot of the ideas that you kind of work in and operate within. And so I kind of want to start this conversation by kind of trying to figure out and understand how you got to be the person that you are, because I find the trajectory of your career and the evolution of your work to be very interesting, and I want to kind of understand that better. So you originally studied architecture, right, in undergrad?
Yes, absolutely. Undergrad, and then I went on to grad school to continue and pursue architecture. Absolutely.
And so if we go back to that, you know, that time in your life, how did you get interested in architecture? What was it about architecture that was interesting to you? What kind of career did you imagine for yourself then when you were 18, 19 years old?
Yeah, I mean, I have kids now. Our son's 15, our daughter's 10. And when I think about when I was 18, my God, I was pretty clueless.
Yeah, right.
So
Right.
I don't think, to be realistic and honest, I didn't have a real clear sense of even an idea about a career. I mean, there were things I had a passion for, and I'll avoid the Lego story, but I will.
Yes.
I will say that I did when I was in high school. I went to a British high school in Rome, so I did the British system, where you basically, when you're 16, you need to choose 2, max 3 subjects. And I had a kind of passion for both art and physics and math. And I'm not going to try, as I said, to do the kind of naive, connecting the dots. Well, that means architecture. But there was something in that landscape that interests me. But I graduated when I was quite young. I was 17, and I took a year off. I came back to Finland, where sort of a big chunk of our family's from. I thought, well, it'd be either industrial design or architecture. I'd kind of be interested in either one. And then there was a very famous architect in Helsinki, Raili and Reima Pietilä. They were sort of a couple, and so I decided in August of whenever that was that I would ring their doorbell. And the wife opened the door
Nice.
and kind of looked at me like, "What the hell are you doing here?" And I was like, "I'd like to come work for you guys." So she thought for maybe 10 seconds and said, "Come on Monday and make us some coffee." And so I worked in their
Yeah.
office for a year, and maybe to bring this kind of entry into kind of closure, I remember I sat down with both architects later on that year, and I was beginning to think about, well, would I want to go and study architecture? And this led me to RISD and doing my undergrad there. And I
Okay.
remember I talked to Riley, who was one of the partners there, and I said, I'm kind of struggling between maybe industrial design or architecture. And she said, "Why would you ever want to do industrial design? Architecture is so much bigger." So then I was
Yeah.
like, okay, that makes sense. So then I left for the States, and it's been
Uh,
a lot of serendipity along the way. I can't claim that I, especially at an early age, ever had a vision of what I was going to do.
when you knocked on that architect's door, what was your perception of an architect? Did you have a good kind of understanding or knowledge of what architecture was when you did that?
Um, well, again, 18, limited
Yeah.
cognitive power. I probably thought I did, but again, to be honest,
Right.
my sense was that it was an architect drew a lot, made models,
Yeah.
had interesting interactions with craftspeople and built stuff. I didn't really probably understand all the other aspects that were involved or even aware of them, that you actually
Right.
negotiate things, that there are contractual issues, that there are financial and legal, that there's a thing called regulations that you need to work within. All of that was something that was just completely out of my, uh, framework. But I do think I had a sense for the overall gist that it was, I'm a bit, you know, I don't like using this word too much, but I knew it was a creative endeavor. And I knew that it connected sort of thinking, coming up with ideas to the doing. And I think that's the thing that I always
Yeah.
enjoyed, was not just thinking
Yeah.
about things and not just doing things, but thinking about doing new things. That always interested me.
Right.
I think that's probably the kind of core of an architect's sort of DNA, or ought to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know exactly what you mean. I feel like I'm the same way. And part of the reason that I asked that question is because when I think back to myself as an 18-year-old wanting to be a graphic designer, and in many ways I feel like I had a much better, clearer definition of what a graphic designer was then. But it was very oversimplified, kind of like what you were talking about with architecture. And now in this field for 10, 15 years, my understanding of graphic design is actually much more confused because it's so much bigger than I kind of thought it was. And I kind of had a sense that it might be the same for you.
Yeah, yeah. Welcome to the club. I think we're all, I don't know
Yeah.
what wisdom brings with it. It certainly brings confusion. That's one thing it does bring.
And so you went to RISD, and then did you go to Harvard right after, or did you work between?
No, no, no. I worked in between, and actually to kind of connect maybe the RISD Harvard trajectory with your original question. I think the thing that was always clear to me in the back of my mind, I kind of repressed it in a certain way, was that I wasn't quite sure that I'd ever do buildings in a kind of odd
Oh.
way. It
Hmm.
just seemed like too many bathroom tiles to design. Like too much
Yeah.
tedious stuff for me.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's tedious stuff in a kind of empirical way, but it didn't quite fit my interest. And so I love the creative process. I love the making stuff. But I think, especially the more I got into architecture, I had this kind of nagging feel. I don't know if I really like this is what I want to do with this education that I'm building. But yeah, I went to RISD, and actually, back when I was going to RISD, there was no thing called the internet. There was just the American
Right.
Embassy Library in Rome. So I went with a friend to the library, and you'd go there because they had this giant book which had all the addresses of all the colleges in the U.S. And so
Right.
I went, flipped through, and I had like 4 or 5 colleges, and RISD was one. I wrote an address down. Then I mailed a letter to them asking for a form, and then I applied to them. I had no clue where I was going. I mean, to be honest, I
Right.
tell this story once in a while, but I was in Finland in that in between year, and then I was going to the US. It was my third time I'd ever been to the US. I'd been in 1977 and 1980 for just a few weeks on a summer
Mm.
vacation. So I left for the year. Really, I left for 5 years. And so I leave Helsinki on a kind of chilly August day with all my
Yeah.
stuff for the whole year. And it include my cross country
Yeah.
skis. And I land in JFK airport, and it was, it's like 120 with, just hallucinating humidity levels. And I got an Amtrak
Yeah.
train to Providence. And I actually realized when I got on the train that I didn't know where Providence was. And so I didn't know if it was like an hour away or 5 hours away. And I remember trying to get my cross country skis on the rack on the Amtrak train while everyone was staring at me. And then I had to keep myself
Right.
awake because I was afraid I was going to be asleep when we got to Providence. But RISD was
That's
fabulous.
amazing.
But the one thing I was really sure about when I graduated from RISD is that that was my academic experience. It was great, but I'm never ever going
Hmm.
to go back to college. And then I came back to
Oh,
Europe, and I did
interesting.
my military
Interesting.
service, worked in the design profession for 2 years, and I started getting this itch to actually get back into education. And that's when I decided to go, or got accepted to Harvard, and went for another 2 years.
Oh, interesting. So that was actually going to be kind of my next question, because you had mentioned earlier that you very early on kind of had this nagging sense that maybe you weren't going to design buildings, and I was kind of interested in if you had that feeling, why did then you go back to school to study architecture again? But it was because you were interested in academia or interested in teaching in some way?
No, I wasn't so much interested in teaching, but there was something about the learning aspect of academia that, and the kind of
Oh,
mental
I see.
challenge and so on. And to be honest, this is why I mentioned I was repressing this feeling about maybe not ending up doing buildings, because I didn't ask that question of myself. Well, why am I going back to grad school? I just felt a yearning. I felt actually quite kind of like things were quite stagnating. I was in Rome for 2 years working for Knoll, the furniture manufacturer, and there's some interesting stuff in it, but like it was like tumbleweed morning and day in the office, and I just couldn't deal with it anymore. Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about, of kind of that wanting that pull to be in the kind of learning environment. Again, that was a big reason why I went to grad school. I feel like my entire career post grad school has been trying to keep that grad school experience
Mm-hmm.
of kind of being a student learning. And so that's why I feel like I'm kind of doing all different types of things at once. And I get the sense that you're the same way. And then did you start teaching then right after you finished at Harvard?
So
Because you were then teaching at Harvard for 10 years or so.
yeah, yeah. So I taught at Harvard for 10 years. So I not immediately, but I ended up
Okay.
in my 2 years of doing my master's. It's a post professional master's, but so anyhow, yeah, I was doing a research project around bending plywood using
Mm.
computer aided design and manufacturing processes. So back then, I was really interested in the whole Charles and Eames work,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
how do you reinvent it with computers, was so kind of the basic thing. So I've
Oh, that's
done quite
interesting.
a lot of work on that, and the graduate school of design at Harvard was gracious enough to say, well, if you're interested in continuing some of the research, here is a bit of space, and then I was doing a bit of TAing on the side, but I did start teaching at RISD actually. So
Mm.
right
Okay.
after Harvard, I TA'd a bit, did some research, and then within the next year, I was at RISD then doing an architecture studio and an industrial design studio, and then I got hired as part of the faculty at Harvard and stayed for 10 years. Yeah.
So while you were teaching and kind of after this grad school time, and I promise this whole interview won't just be a step by step
No,
through
don't
your career.
worry,
I'm
don't
just trying
worry.
to understand
Absolutely.
understand how these things fit together. Um, were you working as a architect or designer simultaneously, or at this point had you kind of fully committed to the academic side?
No, I always enjoyed the practice side of things, but I was always
Okay.
on the margins of sort of the kind of mainstream architecture. So
Mm.
the research I was doing was in materials. So I was doing a lot of this plywood, molded plywood, molded plywood using computer aided design and manufacturing processes. Then I got interested in lightings in the early days of LEDs. Worked with
Mm.
an Italian company, so I was doing a lot of research collaborations with industry, which would be something probably that would be more in the kind of product industrial design context than an architecture school context. But I was running my own practice, so to speak, at the time when I was at Harvard, which was actually working with the performing arts. And it's a bit of a longer story, so I won't bore everybody with all the details. But I worked in the museum field for a bit. I got an internship for the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice, and serendipity had it. I met Robert Wilson, kind of big name in theater, kind of modern theater,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
and through him and meeting Bill Viola on the video end of stuff, I began to realize that a lot of people who are really thoughtful and amazing artists when it comes to putting those art pieces in a 3D context, like an installation, don't necessarily always
Hmm.
think about all the details. So I had the chance of working with Bill Viola, and I was realizing, oh my God, this is how you build a space. I mean, it's quite crudely done. So I started
Yeah.
thinking, oh, as an architect, I could actually resolve a lot of these details so that the environment is supportive of the artistic experience that Bill or anybody else was trying to do. So anyhow, so while I was at Harvard, I would say probably for about 7 years, I was doing this kind of stuff on the side. Merce Cunningham, Bill T. Jones,
Oh,
Paul Kaiser
nice.
in New York. Actually, a lot of the work was through Paul Kaiser, an open-ended group doing some fabulous, fabulous work on sort of digital art. So I was doing this on the side. Certainly not doing buildings, but it
Okay.
somehow had a connection to
Right.
architecture.
Right. And then what kind of classes were you teaching at this time also? And how
Yeah.
did those have any connection to this kind of practice work that you were doing also, or were these kind of two separate tracks for you?
Yeah, there were kind of two separate tracks. Later on in the 10 years at Harvard, those tracks started to merge and melt,
Mhm.
but they were kind
Mhm.
of two separate. So I was teaching, for the most part, I think for like 8 years or 7 years straight, I taught first year a master student
Mm.
architecture studio.
Oh,
So it's the
interesting.
introductory course for people who, basically had little or some architecture background but were starting their master's sort of trajectory. And I really,
Right.
really loved it because it did a couple of things. And this is why I like teaching so much, is that I think
Mhm.
to teach, you need to constantly ask yourself to clarify things, to right?
Yeah.
Because you're going to have people who are
Yeah.
super smart, much smarter than you. These are called students. And then they're going to ask you a whole bunch of questions, and you can't hide behind the jargon. So, it helps really, to teach really helps you articulate and be clear. So I
Yeah.
really, really love that. And then in addition to that, I was doing electives in kind of more the strategy end and product design and product development.
Mm.
So the graduate school design at Harvard is really basically an urban design and architecture, landscape architecture program. It doesn't have industrial design, but I noticed
Right.
back then that there's an increasing interest in the connections and why these sort of domains behave a bit differently. And so I, I had a lot of a lot of students, sorry, attend this elective that I was doing, and I
Yeah.
realized there's a growing interest amongst students to understand why Apple products are the way they are, why they
Right.
differ from other kinds of products, what are the business and other implications. And so this was what was getting me more and more into the kind of strategy end of things and away from architecture.
And I mean, it sounds like that kind of strategy side was something that you were always interested in, and maybe even back when you were kind of repressing this. I'm not going to design buildings. I get a sense that that type of interest was there, even back to saying, should I be an industrial designer or an architect? And I think it's funny that the architects told you, well, you should be an architect because that's bigger. And now I feel like the type of work you do is even bigger than that. So there's this kind of constant widening of what you're working on and thinking about. So that was that was a kind of slow burn, I guess, over the course of teaching, that you were kind of moving into this space, because you ultimately, the question that I'm trying to get to is, what was that kind of intersection like where you leave Harvard to start the Helsinki Design Lab,
Yeah.
basically, and kind of from the outside appear to completely kind of, there's like a hard turn of architecture is done, now I am strategic design. What did that look like, and how did that kind of all come about?
Well, I mean, it was actually a soft turn. I mean, I understand how it looks like a hard turn, and to some degrees it was in terms of the context I was in. So I was going from a very traditional architecture school. I don't mean traditional in a bad sense whatsoever. I just mean that it's positioned to prepare students to enter the architectural profession, and from that context to go into a government context, yeah, the leap is huge. But connected a little bit to the question we were kind of thinking through earlier. I think the 10 years at Harvard were really a self-education process for me, fundamentally. Because at the end of the day, there is no degree in design and government. There's no school that gives you a degree in design and government. And so what I had been doing, in a way, unwittingly unaware, was self-educating myself. And actually, because I was constantly doing things that I really had little knowledge of, I think I enjoyed the most the process of trying to self-learn. And so that became hugely useful. So 10 years was a kind of a self-education process that got me to the point where actually this was a very natural next step. And the second thing was actually an initiative that I've been working on, which was a project called the Stroke Pathways Project, which was looking at stroke care from cradle to grave as a kind of systems challenge. And from a designer's perspective, how would you redesign care to be more aligned with its end objective? And being involved in there, I had an advisory group, which was I used to talk about having a Noah's Ark. You can't connect with everybody who is a stakeholder in a problem, but you can kind of select the representative animals to be there. So we had the CEO of GE Healthcare, because GE was doing the top imaging equipment for dealing with stroke. We had one of the top neurologists in the country, because it affects the brain. We had people, we had the head economic advisor for Obama, because the policy economics, so on, is important. And I'd invited the former prime minister of Finland to be one of those advisors. And so one day he called me after probably about 3 years, sort of seeing the project evolve, and said, that design stuff you're doing at Harvard, we would need that here in government. So would you like to come over? And I turned around to my wife, and we had, I think it was probably about a 7-minute conversation. And then I was like, yeah, sure. I'll pack my bags. We're coming. And then oddly enough, when I was in the U.S., I love the U.S. I miss the U.S. and I need to make it clear, the U.S. I was living in was a bubble, of course, but within that bubble was an incredible intensity of ideas and people and stimulation, which, quite frankly, I miss to this date. But I always felt like I was there just temporarily as a student. I ended up living 15 years in the U.S. So when the call came, it was like, it's time to come back home. I was like, oh yeah, of course. I've just been here temporarily. So that's why I said it ended up feeling like a soft turn.
I definitely talked to Brian about this at length, and I think I talked to Dan quite a bit about it. But can you talk about that term strategic design? Is that something Was that a term that was kind of in the air? Did you have models to look at when you started thinking about this idea of strategic design? How did that all come
Yeah.
about for you?
Well, so when I was doing this, when we were doing, because Brian was involved too, and Justin was involved too, because they were both at Harvard at the
Mm-hmm.
time in this Stroke Pathways project, I was frequently asked to present to, policy people and a whole bunch of people outside of the kind of design domain, and I had to try to explain. I mean, actually, it was what we were doing was difficult to explain to both the non-designers and to the designers. And in an odd way, it
Yeah.
was more difficult to explain to the designers than the non-designers. But I was struggling
Oh, interesting.
for the 5 years that we were doing, the 4 years that we were doing the stroke project, to kind of describe what is it that we're actually doing. I mean, what do we call this thing? And I remember early on, I used to use terms like systems. This is a systems approach or a design approach to systems. And
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
it never really sat quite well with me. A lot of the work we were doing was also collaborating with people at MIT and other organizations. And like systems was a term that was already like, trademarked and copyrighted
Yeah.
and, owned and legally whatever, XYZ. And it was just like, every time I use the word systems, people are
Yeah.
like, are you talking about systems engineering or engineering systems? Those are two completely different things. I'm like, oh really? And so
Right.
I
Right.
started to say, why be shy about the word design? And then I quite
Mm.
for a while started to say, well, actually, what we're doing is we're using design in a strategic capacity. We're not trying to use design to shape a product. While we may end up shaping a product and a service,
Yeah.
actually, the bigger question is how do you make strategically shape?
Mm-hmm.
How you deliver
Mm-hmm.
healthcare, and
Mm-hmm.
but it actually boiled down to a very specific moment in time, because when our former prime minister in Finland called me and said, we need that design stuff here in Finland. That we had a very short conversation around my contract. And then he said, well,
Mm.
what's your title? And I was like, okay, that's a good question. So I said, why don't you give it a thought? And then I remember writing down, like, I'm going to make stuff up now, but it's like, uh, design big stuff. No, government
Yeah.
design lead. And I was like, none of this makes sense. And then I was like, all right, it's strategic design, which I'd been kind of
Mm.
using on and off, depending on the audience that I had been speaking to earlier. So strategic design. Now,
Yeah.
I learned later, the term being used, especially in some countries, like in Finland, had been used, I think, in the 80s, but it was more about
Oh,
branding and
interesting.
advertising. And I remember actually having a conversation with a former faculty member at the university here in Finland, and I said, I don't think that term's very good because it's really about business. And I was like, no.
Right.
And actually, when I've been testing this term out in front of policy people and government people, it seems to resonate. So I was like, I think we're just going to stick with strategic design. So that's not to say that other people weren't talking about
Yeah.
strategic design, but I was completely unaware. I had to put something on paper at that point in time.
Well, you said something else that I thought was interesting in there where you said, why don't I just embrace this word design? What is it about that word design that was so interesting to you or felt right in this context? What is, I mean, I guess the question is, what do you mean when you say design?
Well, that's a good question, right? And
Yeah.
my preamble to that would be to say that whenever I work in government, if I'm working with people for the first time, I won't use the word design, because the next thing that
Oh,
happens is like, well, what do you mean by design? And I'm like, okay, let's not get caught in the weeds
yeah.
here. Let's. So I like to have conversations about what is it that you're struggling with. What are we trying to do, and then you back yourself into design. But back then, design's kind of funny, and I think it's reflected in both the profession and both the education system. If you take Harvard, for example, and you look at how the
Mhm.
graduate schools are positioned, there's a kind of pecking order there. And the pecking
Right.
order starts with the biggies, which are like the business school and the medical school, and they kind of end
Mhm.
with, I hope nobody takes any offense, but with like the divinity school and the design school in that order.
Uh,
And so there's a
yeah.
kind of timidness sometimes that
Mm.
I think is
Hmm.
actually,
Hmm.
there's two sides to a coin. That timidness is the arrogance of design too. So I think in some contexts, people feel like they really need to
Hmm.
put on the full colors of design because we're going to be proud to be designers now and we're different. But when you go into a new
Right.
context, there is a tepidness about that. And I think we had a little bit of that. In fact, when we were working and looking at hospitals and care, people would say usually, "Oh, designers? Oh, yeah. Come take a look at. We just renovated our bathroom." And we're like, "No, not that kind of design. We're talking more like policy and strategy." So you would get that response that
Right.
people thought design was beautification. But then I began to realize that when we were using the word design, people were like high up. I'm talking. So just to give you a bit of context, these would be people in the Pentagon, the
Mm.
leading neurologists in the U.S. and people of that caliber. When they heard that we were designers and we would say like half a sentence, we're trying to take a design approach to the system of healthcare delivery. They would go, "Oh yeah,
Mm.
we get it." In fact, just to
Right.
maybe build on that, a story that both Justin and I lived. We were down in Houston, in Texas,
Oh
and
yeah.
we
Yeah.
were meeting the preeminent neurologist in the U.S. around stroke. And we were in the elevator,
Mm.
I remember, and he said, he's
Hmm.
been working to try to put a stroke system together. He was kind of the leading medical policy person in the U.S. And he said, I'm so happy to see you guys because for 20 years I've been trying to help build a system without really any of the system skills.
Mm.
You know,
Mm.
he literally told us he's been waiting 20 years for people like us. And that's when I think
Huh.
gave us the confidence to this is something new. So sure, we don't know exactly what we're doing, but there is certainly a strong calling for this kind of work.
Something that strikes me about that story and about your work basically after you go back to Helsinki and your career since is the kind of centrality to government in your work and you kind of talking about strategic design specifically for government. And I can't say that I've talked to many people who are operating a practice like that. And I'm interested in why you've decided to focus on government and why you think government is a thing that needs to be redesigned. And I'm asking that question like obviously I know government needs to be redesigned, but I'm kind of curious how you found yourself in that space and why that's the area of your focus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and this is kind of post rationalization, of course. One's in this moment in
Yeah.
career, and so you can kind of look back and say, well, that kind of makes sense described in these terms. And the terms that I would sort of say is that first of all, the challenges that governments are most vexed by are complex, multidimensional kinds of issues that actually design is
Mm.
quite well positioned, not necessarily to solve, but to contribute
Hmm.
to the advancement of the and I think actually without a design sort of skill set in that mix, traditional skill sets struggle very much. I mean, we see it in sort of how governments behave. The other end of the sort of other part to my answer would be to say that governments own the kinds of challenges that I think at least for me was what got me interested in architecture, the public nature of architecture.
Mm. Right.
So
Right.
I respect all my colleagues and friends who work for businesses, and I think it's amazing, and we need that. But personally, I find that a context that if I try to imagine working in, I would struggle. And there's something that really lights a fire in me when I'm thinking about the public good and
Yeah.
and that. So when we think about architects doing public buildings, it's that same sort of deliberative process, that balancing, that multi-dimensional sort of endeavor, which is both short term and long term. which is exciting, and it's very different than working for, say, a private client. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, that was exactly what my next question was, because you kind of started in this space working within a government, and now you are operating your own company where you are kind of consulting and working with clients who are, from what I understand, largely governments. How is that relationship different, where you are now an outside person?
Yeah.
How does that change how you think about this? Maybe a better way to ask this question is, what do those engagements look like?
So I think not to get too militaristic here, but the mission is the
Okay.
same. Okay.
Right. Right.
But it's your relationship to the mission that's different. And so maybe
Mhm.
now I'll play on the military analogy here and say that I feel that I'm a bit of a mercenary.
Mm.
Meaning, and
Yeah.
I hope some of my clients who may or may not be listening to this take no offense. I mean this truly in a positive, constructive way. But frequently, myself and others in my same position are, in a way, mercenaries because we're called upon to do the dirty work that the organization can't do or doesn't want to do. And in a certain way, that's what mercenaries
Okay.
do, is they fight the dirty wars that
Right.
the traditional army doesn't want, or people in the country don't want. And because at the end of the day, design, when we're talking about in an innovation context where design is used to create new kinds of solutions and new kinds of ideas, is always going to be ideological. There's this idea
Right.
that
Right.
innovation is purely technocratic. No, that's BS. It's always going to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
ideological. And in that sense, a lot of the work to innovate, to change, to transform the current public sector, which is really stuck in an 18th century kind of framework, is going to be
Hmm.
ideological and sometimes impossible for the organization itself to take upon for political reasons, for other kinds of
Hmm.
reasons.
Hmm.
But I think also the challenge of being on the other side and being a consultancy relationship is the kind of procedures, the kind of the procurements, the kind of business logics of government, which I don't know, just really aren't in
Yeah.
support of the public good. It's very funny, actually. I
Yeah.
find
Yeah. Yeah.
that the whole idea of public procurement is a very positive
Yeah.
one, but it actually ends up shooting itself in the foot. So government spends more money in the dumber ways, but with apparently more transparency. Okay, that's a trade-off, I guess one can make.
Can you talk more about what I have two questions, and I hope these questions make
Yeah.
sense. I'm not sure I can articulate them in a clear way. The first one I think will make sense. I'm curious about what when a government comes to you and say, we want to hire you as a consultant, what kind of problems, what kind of problems do they have that they're coming to you for, or B, or somewhat related, why do they think they need to come to you for help, or what are they kind of asking for? And then the opposite end of the question is, what are you specifically kind of bringing to that relationship?
hmm hmm So it's hard to generalize, but I'll do it because it's fun.
Yeah.
But I think, and I'm erring here on caricature. So, but frequently the
Okay. Okay.
engagement is the following: I might get an email or a call. We're doing an event in April. We're looking for somebody to kind of, think outside the box. We hear you live outside
Mm.
the box, so could you come and do a talk? So I'm like, sure. So what do you want me to talk about? So then we start chatting a bit, and then after that conversation, they're like, well, this is kind of interesting. So yeah, why don't you mark that thing in your calendar, and can we have a follow-up call? And I'm like, okay. Then we have the follow-up call, and they say, you know what? We were thinking a little bit
Mm.
about what we were talking about, and actually we would need a little bit of help, just maybe working with our teams a bit. So could you give a talk and work with our teams a bit? I'm like,
Mm.
yeah, sure. They're like, okay, could we have a follow-up call? Then we'll have the third call. And they're like, we've been thinking about this a little bit. We'd love you to give that talk and work with our teams a little bit, but we also would like, some strategy work with our, and, by the seventh call, we were like, okay, and there's an engagement that's completely different than where it sort of started off. So it's a bit of a caricature,
Right.
but it's actually rooted in reality. So but I think it's representative of the fact that I think a lot of the public sector is under a lot of stress. I mean, take the whole U.S. context and the Trump administration. So there's a lot of political stress. There's a lot of austerity stress too, and so on. And the day-to-day work of public servants is, can be quite stressful. So the machinery doesn't have much time to stop and ask itself, what does it need? And so sometimes these engagements that are just like, oh, come give a chat, raise a conversation that should have been had 10 years ago.
Right.
And that kind of leads to the work. But the challenge doing this work is that there is no line item in government budgets to do design work or innovation work. So once you light up the fire that, you know what? Yeah, it's true. It is 2019 and the world has changed. Yeah. Then the next thing is, oh, but can you do it for free? Because we don't have a budget for it,
Right.
right? So
Right.
that's part of the challenge.
Okay, I see. That now makes a lot more sense to me about kind of I guess that last series of questions was me trying to understand what it is you actually do, and how clients come to you. And now I get it. Like that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, let me just interject a little thing because you mentioned at the top of this our conversation that you've talked to Brian Boyer and Justin Cook and Dan Hill, who I've had the huge honor to work with in the past. But specifically, Justin and Brian, they've and again, this goes slightly in the humor department, but they were accusing me when we were working at the fund for ruining their careers because we're doing something that is not a career. There's no profession, But the other side to this was that I think it was Brian that was saying that his family was convinced that he was a spy because he could not explain. And I have the same problem. I can't explain to people what I do. So
Yeah.
so you're working for a foreign government. You travel a lot. You know what could it be? And you can't explain what you're doing. Of course, you're a spy. So I'm
Right.
happy that at
Oh,
least
that's amazing.
we've been able to build a little bit. But it's very difficult when you and this is the kind of oddity of all of this. When we were doing that stroke work early on, and we realized that people way up in Washington were struggling with healthcare and really understanding how you could transform healthcare to something completely different. They just didn't have the skills and design. They had the aha when we were talking to them. So there is a huge need for design to get involved in shaping decision making. But there are no schools, there is no career path, there is no profession, and there are no line item
Right.
budgets in governments to do this work. So that is the kind of, let's say, challenge right now is how do you begin to sort of structure some of that?
Yeah. How I mean, that's how do you do that? That's kind of a joke question, but I was actually thinking about Brian and Justin saying that you've ruined their careers, and that this is a very, this isn't necessarily an industry, or that there are a lot of people doing this. And where do you see this type of work going, or how could this be expanded, or how could more people kind of, who are interested in this get involved or engage in some of these issues that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I think in a certain way, a lot of this stuff is in the early days. So I
Yeah.
think a lot of the learning is happening in the field. So for anybody who's interested, and I get this a lot from students or practitioners who are interested in getting involved in government, just find a way to get involved in government work. Whether it's through a summer internship or do a grassroots effort, work with an NGO that's working with government. I don't know. Just get experience, because actually the experience will help you be able to provide something and build the connections that are
Yeah.
necessary that aren't readily available out there. I mean, a funny
Yeah.
thing, when I was at Harvard, and I think it was like probably in year 8 of my 10-year stay there, there was one of the top magazines in the U.S. had a rankings of the top design schools in the U.S. And I was flipping through it, and I was like, "Oh, Harvard's in it." And I was like, "But it wasn't the design school; it was the business school that was ranked as the top design school." So I remember I went to our dean, and I was like, "Have you seen this?" And I remember just generally when I was going around the hallway and
Yeah.
asking my faculty colleagues, "Have you guys seen this?" Like everyone's like,
Yeah.
What about it?" I'm like, "What do you mean, what about it?" and, and I think that was symbolic of the
Yeah.
fact that there is this huge ask for for design that is a different kind of ask than what the professions, the schools are preparing for, the traditional professions. And it's the
Mhm.
other schools that are maybe a bit more nimble because they don't have a vested interest, they don't have a legacy in design, that are able to actually move on it. And it's been the business schools that have
Right.
popularized, the design thinking term, which I actually
Right.
don't
Right.
like personally, because for me, design is so
Yeah.
much
Yeah. Yeah. Same. Me too.
the connection of the thinking to the doing. And I know that just seems like an
Right. Right.
oversimplification, but it's a huge distinction from how it's talked in terms. So my big dream back at Harvard was if the Kennedy School, which is the School of Government, and the design school could work together to make a program that could be something quite interesting. I think eventually it'll happen once there's more and more sort of momentum in this field. I see a lot of people self-educating. I see some nonprofits starting to create programs. I'm working with Nesta, which is a UK-based sort of innovation agency, and I've been helping them with States of Change, which is kind of like a training program for governments. So there's those kinds of
Oh,
initiatives
cool.
that are taking ground. Um, and I think there was something else I was going to say, which was going to be really insightful, but I can't remember right now. But we'll see
Okay.
how this landscape shapes itself. But just
Yeah.
maybe to
Yeah.
conclude that, one of the things, and huge, thanks go to the team, and I think Brian was quite instrumental of all of us in doing this, is to make sure that as we in practice doing these new kinds of things do work, that work needs to be public so that others can learn from it, because there's no available textbook out there to learn from. So I think there's an obligation for all of us to make the work public.
Let me ask you the kind of opposite side of that question a bit. Going back to the beginning of this conversation, talking about studying architecture, what from that education do you think has been helpful or instrumental in the work you're doing now,
Hmm. So many things.
if
I
any?
mean,
Okay.
I think it is at its best an amazing education process. I think that if I had to highlight a
Mm.
few things that I think are really quite instrumental, first of all, the whole idea of a studio, I think, is kind of at the
Right.
core
Oh,
of that.
yeah.
Both being in a studio as a student, but also teaching a studio is fantastic. I mean, one of the things I used to do when we teach, and it's not just me, but like it's standard practice, it would be to, give 12 people in a studio the same simple task, and you would notice that you would get 12 variations on a theme, or 12
Yeah.
interpretations, or 12 different themes off of the same question. And then if you ask each one
Right.
of them to do, 4, you have 48. And what's amazing about that, very quickly, you can begin to generate a whole range of different interpretations based on the same question. You can build almost like a taxonomy
Hmm.
of possible ways of framing that question. And when you do it as a kind of group, we're all limited by our past experiences. And so
Yeah.
our ability to think about or conceive of things that in some way or another are not part of our lexicon of experiences is almost virtually impossible. And so that's the beauty of having 12 different people coming together. So I would say the studio is an amazing way of expanding things, I love also in the education process the combination of theory, sort of technology, and the process of design. And I think especially in
Yeah.
architecture, where the history, theory, technology component come together, it gives you a very well-rounded way of thinking about things, which I think when you go and skip forward into a context of government, that's exactly the kind of sort of multidimensional thinking you need to do. What's the theoretical basis for assuming that a different approach can lead to a better solution? What is the cultural and historical context in which you're operating, and what are some of the techniques and technologies that can enable that? To be able to put that together as a complete solution is kind of the process of architecture. So I like that sort of 360 whole approach, and the studio. I think probably those are two of the things. And
Yeah.
I love drawing
Yeah.
by hand, as maybe some people
Mm.
can attest to. I used to be a bit of I mean this in the most positive way, but a bit of a pencil drawing Nazi, in the sense that I thought it was, and I still believe it's an important skill to learn, even in the age of computers.
My last question, and this is kind of a big question, but this is the question that I use to end all of these conversations. I'm kind of curious, what are some of your favorite books or favorite authors? Who are the people that you kind of read for as models for all of this that we've been talking about for the
Yeah,
last hour
yeah.
or so?
So actually, I'm going to say something really sad, and then you can choose to either erase it and kind of, help me keep up a facade, or then reveal the truth. But I,
Okay.
I have so little time to read these days that it's really sad.
Mm.
It's pathetic. But there was a day when I used to read, and I hope I can come back to that day. I'm working very hard. So the truth is that I very rarely have the opportunity to read. But that's not to say that I haven't read. So I will answer your question. I think when we're talking about this work, and it will sound a bit like a cliche, because undoubtedly a lot of the people who are kind of in this genre will point to the same things. But you
Mm.
got Papanek, um, Victor Papanek's books.
Mm.
You've
Hmm.
got
Hmm.
oh, Buckminster Fuller, and his writings.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think there is something that happened back then that if you read some of those texts, I mean, it's like time has
Yeah.
not moved. It's pretty
Yeah.
spooky in a certain way, and it's huge testament to their ability to think way above and beyond the kind of normative. I think
Yeah.
something that we are increasingly struggling with doing. But then there are also other kinds of people, or maybe aren't, they're close to that mainstream, but not quite in it. People like Norman Bell Geddes. He was an industrial designer, and there's a book called Magic Motorways.
Mm.
And
Oh, I don't
yeah,
know
it's
that.
it's a pretty fascinating book. One of the last things I did in the U.S. is I found an original copy online, and I bought it.
Oh,
So I
nice.
bought original copies of all these books that for me have been quite important.
Yeah.
And Magic Motorways talks about. It lays a vision of how the automobile will transform the U.S. And he lays out
Mm.
a kind of system of three kinds of roads. And I forget what they're called, but there's basically the kind of scenic kind of road, and so he draws this kind of squiggly. And the purpose of that driving is to see places and to fall in love with the scene.
Mm.
And then on the other end
Hmm.
of the spectrum is the motor highway, whose purpose was to get you from A to B as quickly as possible. And when you read that book,
Right.
it basically outlines what happened in the US. When you read Norman Bell
Mm.
Geddes' stuff, he talks about what is the role of the designer. Here we're talking about Futurama, I think 1939, the World's Fair. And a lot of these designers
Mm.
were
Yeah. Yeah.
involved
Yeah.
in a very strategic capacity to actually help position a new vision of the future, which was really trying to compete
Right.
with the war that was going on in Europe as a kind of an alternative.
Yeah.
And it was interesting how these people who are for the most part trained as a lot of them did window dresses for the department stores. So they had a kind of panache for the drama, amongst other things.
Yeah.
And he talks about the role of design is to, distill complex ideas so the masses can understand them. Something along those lines. Now, it sounds maybe in 2019 slightly condescending, but I think if you try to understand what he's articulating is this idea that there are very complex things that until you give it form, most people won't be able to see, quite literally. And then it's the role of the designers to help people see not just what the questions are, but the possible futures. And that's what Futurama was very much about. So that work was fantastic. Then I don't know what happened in between, but I think we're beginning to revisit some of that. And I think what's interesting today is that we're a bit of it is kind of, I'm not good on words, so I'm going to make up a kind of semi-term, but it's kind of like researchy, hipster-ish kind of semi-science and semi-narrative kind of work. But that is rooted in facts. And the reason why it's a bit hipster and it's a bit narrative is that I think some of the facts that are rooted in reality, I mean, that's what a fact kind of, I guess, is, are maybe exaggerated or are built around a specific kind of narrative. But there are books like I'm revisiting right now, Habit, that talks about sort of the science of habit from individuals to organizations. And when you look at some of that, it's fascinating. And so we're beginning to get into this era where we're looking at facts and data and sort of a new kind of science and building new narratives. And I think we're stitching it to this legacy that was really important. And now we have some of the behavioral insights at an organizational level to try to think about, and this is a lot the work that I do at the end of the day, is how do you build a logic for an organization that's able to fulfill a different mission. Because if you I got enamored early on when I was 18, where we started our conversation, by the object, by the beautiful object. And then you go to school and you're like, oh, there's a beautiful process, behind the object.
Right.
And then when you start getting involved, you realize, no, there's got to be a beautiful DNA in an organization that enables a beautiful process that ends with a beautiful product. Right. So for organizations to fixate on the shiny object is irrelevant. They need to start fixating on what's the nature of work. And in that sense, my work nowadays is very much about trying to design new logics in public organizations that are capable of then delivering new kinds of solutions. So that's why I like this kind of quasi-science that's emerging. With the legacy of the people like Norman Bell Geddes and all.
I love that. I feel like that was a perfect way to kind of wrap up this entire conversation too. Marco, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I enjoyed this conversation immensely. Really love how you think about this and the work that you're doing. So thanks for your time. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you. It was a real honor. Really enjoyed it too. Thanks.
This episode was recorded on July 18th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.